This is here so that I can sing to you in case I fail in this presentation. My little stand. Today, I discussed with Ralph the subject we talked about. And this lecture here, I traveled all the way to England and gave this lecture. And they told me it was the most popular lecture they had, and then I discovered why. The president of the Historical Society worked for the Post Office Department for 20 years, and her husband had worked for 25 years. And when I got into the postal part of it, they were totally titillated. They were going to travel out to Brookfield to look at the Franklin markers. Well, they didn't get out here, but the fact remains that it was a very popular topic. So when I get into that, I think you'll enjoy it too when you realize when you will go and buy a stamp for 33 cents today, you'll be eternally grateful when you find what you would have had to pay 150 years ago to mail a letter. So with that in mind, we're going to talk first about the roads that pass through New England, and we play a crucial part in the development of roads in America, and primarily in Massachusetts, which was the leading power in New England in the 17th century. Now, I don't know if you can see that. I think you can't. These will be around after, but for the sake of talking, I think you'll be able to make out what I'm talking about. Can you all see that, or at least see it enough to know it's a map? This is the coast of Maine, Cape Ann, Boston. This is Cape Cod, under Martha's Vineyard, and we come down into Rhode Island. New York City is down here, and this is Long Island. Now, when the country first formed, the first settlement was Plymouth, of course. We all know that, and that was in 1620. But that was not the most significant government in the New World. Massachusetts itself was, and it followed Plymouth by some 9 years. But I want to give you an idea, before we get into the roads and why they had to develop them, what the governments were that existed during the time of the King Philip War. So we're talking about 1670, in the 1670-75 period. So I'll let you know what the governments were that were operating at that time, what our population was. So that'll give you an idea of the power of the different governments. And then we get into the post roads and things, you'll see why Boston became the focal point for the development of the road systems when Ben Franklin undertook this task, or his operatives. So consequently, I hope I'm not blocking anyone off. Can you all see the map all right? We'll start up here because 1670s in Maine and New Hampshire, there were fewer than 1,000 Englishmen living, and far fewer Indians. The orange here represents New Hampshire. The pink, which you can't see from where you're at, is Maine. The next government is identified in this purple color, and that was Massachusetts Bay. Now, Massachusetts Bay was the largest. It had 25,000 Englishmen by the 1675s, and it had roughly 30 towns that went from Boston inland to as far as Marlborough, a distance of about 30 miles. And then along the Connecticut River, from Springfield north to Northfield, including Deerfield and Hadley and Northampton, they had another series of towns. Then we'll get back into that in a few minutes. The next government is in yellow. This was Plymouth. Now, Plymouth had 10 towns at the time, and it had 6,000 residents. As we move further to the west, the red is Rhode Island. And you know Roger Williams in 1637 was found to be a heretic of sorts because he felt that you didn't need a minister to intervene between yourself and your God when you had prayer. And so this was, the Puritans found this totally unacceptable, and it was suggested he leave before he was punished, and he left. Found his way down into Rhode Island. Now Rhode Island is in red, and there are 4,000 people living in Rhode Island by the time the King Philip War starts. Connecticut is next, and that's the sort of a gold color, and it's in two sections. And later you can look at the map and get an idea of the communities, but it ran from Rhode Island partway across to the Connecticut River, and then it was a break, and it picked up a little further south and ran there for a period of distance of about 30 miles. And Connecticut had a total of 6,000 people between two urban settlements of Connecticut. And New Haven is the last government. And there was a section of New Haven here that interrupted the Connecticut colonies, as well as a section leading on from Connecticut down into New York City. And a part of Long Island also belonged to New Haven. New Haven also had 6,000 people. Now the government of Massachusetts, the government of Plymouth, and all the way up into Maine became one government in 1690 when the new governor Andros, who was appointed by the English king, came and he eliminated our charters and combined the governments. He also combined Connecticut and New Haven into a single government. He was sent away in chains when he tried to take all the land back and resell the land to all the settlers that were living here for a price. It was all money. So it hasn't changed very much today either, has it? Now, to give you an idea of why the roads developed, Marlborough is 30 miles west of Boston, Marlborough and Lancaster, right near the city. Lancaster's here, here's Marlborough. Springfield sits here in this other circle. From Marlborough to Springfield was 70 miles. These were Puritans. If you read a book on Puritan mindset, you'll realize these people were afraid of everything. They were afraid of their God. They were afraid he would punish them. If they did something wrong, they would figure he would punish them if they did something that he didn't approve of. If they did something right, it might not be the right thing for the Lord, and they might be punished for that. So they're always in mortal fear that they were going to be punished by this almighty God. They also were afraid of the wilderness. The wilderness to them was a dark place, and a lot of the writings of the period, they identified the wilderness as a place filled with rattlesnakes, wolves, and lions. They had a great imagination. But the general court, in its wisdom, decided that the 70 miles, because the alternate was to go around the Cape, down to the Connecticut River, up to Windsor Locks, then make a portage around to Springfield, where once again the Connecticut River was navigable, and travel north up the river. It might take you 4 months to go from here up to Hadley. There was another route through here that might take you 2.5 months, but it was through a pretty dangerous area because you were going through the area where the Pequots had once lived, where the Mohegans is still in existence, and the Narragansetts were very warlike people. So that was a pretty risky place to travel. So the general court decided that Quaboag, which was a nice rounded hill halfway between Marlborough and Springfield, would make an ideal settlement. And it came just 30-odd miles from Marlborough to Brookfield, or at the time Quaboag, and then another 30 miles into Springfield. Obviously, it was more than a day's run by horses, because no wheeled carts could manage that road. No wheeled carts at all could manage that road. So it was all usually horse and pack animal to move goods, services across that road. But it did provide a sanctuary in the wilderness for people that were traveling, and lots of people traveled in those days. It also gave the military a sanctuary, a place where they could stop, where they could refresh themselves, they could recompose their units, and do some scouting along the way, which was paramount to identifying where the Indians were, because we were surrounded by 6 Indian camps. Quaboag itself was surrounded by 6 very well-defined Indian camps. One of them, which was in the southern New Braintree, was a magnet that brought in Indians from all over New England at times. So anyway, this was a good idea. They decided that we would have this community established in Quaboag, and it came to pass. In 1660, people were already living on the ground here. By 1665, the town was incorporated, and by the 1673, it was known as Brookfield. Now we'll move to our next series of roads. And we have to do all this till we get to the Gulf Road, because that identifies where the population centers developed, and they developed along the roads. This is hard for you to see from back where you are, so later on if you want to come and look at this, it's really an interesting presentation. What it does is define all of the roads that existed in New England, and you can see where the population centers were by the mass of roads right here, because Massachusetts was the power They could produce the largest army. They could field an army of 1,000 men within a few weeks' notice. No other organization in America could do that, with the exception of the Indians. They had advantages that we didn't have. Now, let me tell you about the roads. I told you about Roger Williams leaving here in 1637. Well, in 1633, a fellow by the name of Olds decided he was going to find a different way overland to Hartford, Connecticut. So Olds in 1633, and that's the yellow road that you see here, out of Boston, headed west to Wayland and struck south through Hopkinton, Millbury, Oxford, Webster, through Woodstock, and on through Manchester into Hartford. That was a long, serious trip. Very poor route. It would take a month to 6 weeks to make that journey. It was difficult. It was a very difficult journey to make. It was not a good road. Then, when Roger Williams left and was literally driven out of Massachusetts, he followed Oldham's road until he got down here to Woodstock. And Woodstock, he struck east. And he went down through and established Providence as a community. And the road continued on as far as Bristol. So the green leg on Oldham's yellow route is Roger Williams' road. Now, John Bradford, who was the son of Governor Bradford, states in 1648, today a new route has been found to Connecticut. It passes through Crabtree Falls, and he goes on and on to explain it. Well, Crabtree Falls is right down here, off Route 67, where it turns off Route 9 in West Brookfield. There's a little dam there, and water's still running there. You'll see it off to your left, about half a mile after you turn off on Route 67. That didn't used to be a dam, it was just a waterfall. The road went by that, and further up that string is an old stone bridge, which you can't get at, because some Pakistanis have bought the old farm up there, and they said they're not obliged to celebrate New England history. Therefore, my 2 school buses full of children were denied access to this road and this old bridge, so we weren't able to share that. Now I understand they're being sued for some reason, and I'm beside myself. I'm so happy. I'm not the least bit prejudiced, but I don't like those people. They need to go back where they came from. But at any rate, the new road to Connecticut was actually a horrible road, but it was better than anything they had up to date. That is the orange route you see here. Now that started in Boston and went up through Sudbury, through Bolton, Sterling, Princeton, Rutland, down through Barry and New Braintree, through West Brookfield, and continued on to Brookfield, where it went by Steerage Rock. I don't know if you're familiar with Steerage Rock or not. Went by Steerage Rock, continued through Palmer and Ludlow and into Springfield and hence to Hartford. Now that really was an unnamed...
How come you went so far north?
Because what they had to do was take routes where people had traveled. See, Woodford and Sasbury had made a map in 1648. Their map showed a line from Boston directly across to Springfield, a straight line. Everything was on that line. Nothing was to the north of it, and nothing was to the south of it. Mileage-wise, it was fabulous. You could tell that they were nautical people. They were able to calculate using the stars, and from 2 different points they were able to triangulate and establish distance. And they did a beautiful job of this. They could tell you exactly how far it was from Quabog, from Boston, but they had never seen it. So it was a straight line. All you had to do was aim at Springfield and you'd be there. Oh, my eye. They took the route that was easiest at the time. So consequently, later on it was to be called the Old Bay Path. But it couldn't be the Old Bay Path until you had a new one. Well, when it became apparent we were going to have trouble with the Indians during the King Philip Wars, the General Court established a requirement and charged that a road would be manufactured from Boston through Quabog to Springfield, and a further leg was to be established to move to the northern Connecticut River towns. Now, that was called the Military Highway. That's 1673, and the archives will refer to the Military Highway. Because we had an old bay path, we had 2 bay paths now. One had to be the old one because it was there 30 years before this one, so this one became the new Bay Path. So we had some of each, you see. And anybody who lived west of Boston, I don't care what little road they lived off from or where they were at, they lived on the Bay Path, because ultimately if you followed their road, it would lead to one of these major highways and take you to Boston. So everybody lived on the Bay Path, they said. Well, you know, logic has it that probably if we lived in, we'd think the same thing. But military highway came through. Now that is indicated in blue. And it went through Sudbury, back to Lancaster, and then struck south through Paxton, Spencer, East Brookfield. And if you follow the blue, it goes down through Warren, West Warren, Thorndikes, Three Rivers, down by Red Bridge, Ludlow, and into Springfield, and then south to Hartford. Now the leg of the road that was to go to the northern Connecticut towns was called by locals the Hadley Path. If you get to the other end of that and go to Hadley, they don't know anything about the Hadley Path. They know they live on the Bay Path. But we call it the Hadley Path. It's a lot like going to East Brookfield. You're on the East Brookfield Road till you get to the sign, and then North Brookfield has their own nomenclature for these roads. So, you know, you can change roads without ever leaving the highway, you know, or the direction you're traveling in. But anyway, this road broke off the other side of West Brookfield along Route 9 now, just about a mile out of town. There's a road to the left that goes sharp up over Coy Hill and down through Ware and across the Narrows and Ware, across the Ware River, on into Belchertown and then into Hadley, and that was the Hadley Path. That that road would indeed support two-wheeled vehicles. You could take an ox cart and certainly pull goods and services across that road, people and militia and their paraphernalia. Not with ease. Not with ease. You have to understand that. Because the towns along the way were constantly being sued by the general court because they didn't put their men to work patching the roads and rebuilding the bridges. And that was service in lieu of taxes. So to pay your property tax if you lived in at that point in time, a man would volunteer 3 days labor to pay his property tax, and he would apply either for bridge maintenance or work on the roads, and if they could use him, and most likely they could, they would put him to work, and that would pay his taxes. Now it's interesting to note that Brookfield, just before it was destroyed during the King Philip Wars, which was in August of 1675, it was summoned to appear in Springfield. It was being sued because it failed to maintain the roads going over the backside of Foster Hill. I don't know how modern equipment and a modern highway department could have begin to. John, you spent a lot of time on that road helping me. I don't know how anybody could maintain that road. But they were going to have to go to court. And they called it off after the town was destroyed and nobody else lived there. So there was nobody to appear in court. So that ended that discussion. Now, I want to take one more path. And it doesn't play much of a part in the English settlement of New England, but someone who was here first, and it was called the Nipmuc Path. And of course, depends on who you talk to. You talk to a lot of Indians, and we're all Nipmucs. They're all Nipmucs that live in southern Massachusetts. Well, that's sheer and utter nonsense. The Indians that lived around here were not Nipmucs. They called themselves the people. And Englishmen always had to put a name on things, so we called them Quabos. And we called the Indians down in Webster Nipmucs because they had a word that sounded like that. It was an Algonquin word. The closest relative to the Brookfield Indians was down in Agawam. There was a branch of the local Quabog Indians who lived there. So we call them that because in their language it meant red water. Some people interpret it as red earth, but it was from heavy iron oxides that you find in the lakes in the Brookfield area that gave Quabog its name. So at any rate, the Nipmuc's path started down here in Agawam, ran across just to the south of Wilbraham through Munson and Springfield, Fiskdale, Sturbridge, Southbridge, and then directly south to Norwich, Connecticut. And that was their main line of moving between the areas that they either had allies or that was their path that they used for commerce and what have you. And these were well-established paths. with that in mind, let me move to our last map. Now, if you lived back in the so-called good old days, and you wanted to send a letter to somebody, it didn't cost you a cent. But the poor guy getting the letter had to pay all the postage. Wow, what a deal that was. What if you got a bill from somebody you didn't want to hear from, huh? Just don't pick up your letter, somebody else had to pay the freight. The idea behind this was that someone writing the post and carrying the letters, if he got halfway here and he got tired, if you had paid beforehand, he could just burn the letters and say, well, I dropped them off and they're gone, you know, it's not my fault. But if he didn't get paid till he delivered them, he made darn sure those letters got where they were supposed to go. So anyway, this was going to change because in, it's got such a long title I have to read it because I can never remember it. Our good King George in 1751 appointed Benjamin Franklin as postmaster of His Majesty's northern provinces and dominions. So Ben Franklin became our postmaster general. And his organization put together a plan to develop a postal system based somewhat on the English postal system, but a little more sophisticated. Now this postal system was made up of 3 rows. 3 rows. The orange one you see here is the northern or upper post road, and it went from Boston down to New York City. And it went through the various towns of Marlborough, Shrewsbury, Worcester, Spencer, Brookfield, Warren, so forth. The middle road is the one shown in blue. That started in Boston, struck south at Cambridge to Dedham, and then swung to the west through Medfield and Uxbridge, and down through Manchester and into Hartford. And that was the central post road. And from there, it went south to New York. Now the southern, or lower road, again, had the same origin in Boston. Went to Cambridge and struck south through Dedham and Wrentham, Attleboro, went all the way down through the islands, through Portsmouth, and on through to New Haven, and hence to New York. And it had a dogleg. The dogleg went up through and tied in Pawtucket and Providence with the southern or lower road. Now, along that road, Ben Franklin decided every mile he would put a marker, and then someone in New York would calculate, and they'd have tables, and they would say, well, there's 180 miles to Lancaster, and he would calculate the rate of postage for that letter for that 180 miles. Or 824, it was anybody's guess what it cost them to go, whatever the traffic would bear. So anyway, now you could pay in advance, and your letter would be carried by government employees as post riders. So you had a halfway chance of getting your letter and not having to pay for it on the other end. But we still weren't bright enough to come up with this postage stamp business. So, you know, it was always a controversy. Did someone pay the postage or did they not? You know, slip your mail into the rider's bag and he'd never know the difference. But at any rate, Ben also decided that along that route he would put a marker every mile. So his group put together a vehicle with a large wheel, and after so many revolutions it turned a cog, which turned another, and it established mile markers amazingly accurate. And every mile marker, someone would get off the cart and drive a stake in the north side of the road, and it would go on its way. And in the meantime, they had negotiated with stone cutters to cut these stones, and you'll see them all along Route 9. There are actually 12 now, an unbroken line from, there's 18 in an unbroken line from Leicester all the way into the western part of Warren. One of the stones that was stolen 25 years ago came back to me a few months ago, and it's up in the police garage, locked up until we can put it back where it belongs. It was a kid's prank, and it got out of hand, and they were afraid to bring it back for 25 years, but we have it back now. And so now we have the longest unbroken chain of Franklin markers in existence. There are 18, 12 of which are in what was the greater Brookfield, which included from East Brookfield all the way through to the midsection of Warren, which was all part of the original town. Now, he contracted with people to make these markers and carve them, and most of them, particularly from Springfield North, would say how many miles to Boston. And that was great for travelers along that road now, because that road began to improve dramatically. Not that good, but it got better. And so consequently, at least you knew where you were going. And periodically, there's not enough stones left to get the sequence, how often it occurred. It might have been every 25 or every 50 markers. There would be a marker saying so many miles to Springfield, and the same marker would say so many miles to Boston. There's one on Foster Hill like that now, just before Mr. Richardson's house up there. So at least travelers along the way would have an idea how far they've come and how far they've got to go. Along this upper road, George Washington had an opportunity to travel twice. The first time he came up was in 1775 when he took command of what was forming. It would be the Continental Army here in Massachusetts. So we were the rebels, we were the troublemakers, we were raising the army. We had 12,000 men under arms after the alarms in 1775. So he came up here to take command. And then later, much later, in October of 1789, he traveled this route to go to Boston when he was our first president. So he traveled along this route, and it's great to know the other famous people did too. Along the old road from Ticonderoga, the old Crown Point Road, it went down through what's now Route 20 west of Springfield, and picked up our upper post road in Springfield. And when Henry Knox with the cannon from Ticonderoga down to Dorchester Heights in Boston, and the British woke up one morning and found 50 huge cannons pointing down at their fleet. And they decided they would move out of town and vacate Boston. What they didn't know was it was a single charge of powder from each gun. We had one shot and it was all over. They didn't get a chance, they bugged out before they challenged it. So the fact remains that we drove them out of Massachusetts and the war shifted to the south. And after that, we had to supply men, but the war left Massachusetts for all intents and purposes. But we had the first year of it. Burgoyne's army, when it was taken up here in Sarasota, they marched along the same Crown Road, came through Springfield. There was some of these scoundrels who escaped later that were involved in the Bathsheba Schooner murder. And actually 3 of the soldiers involved, one of them became a servant in Schooner's house. 2 of the soldiers that actually participated in the murder were escapees from Burgoyne's army. They were marching down this road to Charleston, where they were held as prisoners until well into the war, when they were later marched right back up along the old Bay Path to Rutland, where they spent the rest of the war either escaping or living in Rutland, because we didn't have enough troops to hold them, so they stayed only because there was some food there. The first mail left New York City January 23rd in 1673, and it arrived in Boston February 5th. It took 15 days by rider to travel from here up the northern road to here. And it was a single man riding and changing horses. I'm sure they didn't ride 24 hours a day, because it's awfully hard to stay away 15 days. And he might have changed, and I don't know that. I don't know enough about the personnel staffing to answer that. But the King Philip War stopped all mail. All mail stopped along these roads. There was no more mail. You couldn't communicate from this point to this point unless you were able to go there. And it stayed in this state until 1780, when all vestiges of the Indians at war against the governments of Massachusetts had come to rest. First freight wagons went from Boston to New York in 1761. Now the upper road from here to New York was 250 miles long. The middle road was 230 miles, but that includes the lake, it duplicates the northern road that picks up down in New Haven and goes down into Hartford and down into New York. And the lower road was 270 miles, which included that dogwood. That's a long ways to travel. Now, Fred Wood wrote a book. It's called Turnpikes of New England. He said the roads were very difficult. During the Revolutionary War period, it took 6 days in the summer and 9 days in the winter to go from Boston to New York. Now, the stage wagons, Levi Pease was the first one to establish these stage wagons as soon as the roads got good enough. He started these in 1761, and what it was a four-wheeled farm cart for all intent and purposes, no, unsprung. And they put boards across it, and up to a total of 12 people would sit on those boards with no back support, and they would ride those things with no springing. And I guess most of the time they pushed, based on accounts that I've read, because the roads weren't really that good. So you can imagine, however, when the roads improved by 1783, right after the Revolutionary War, it would take you a little under 4 days to go from here to New York. We had 125 stage lines running along those post roads in New England by 1825. And you could go by 1825 from New York to, from Boston to New York in 40 hours. Now that's a lot of progress, as opposed to 9 days just a wee bit earlier. In 1838, when the trains came through, it went through Brookfield in 1837, became functional in 1838, connected to Springfield, and then there was a route to the south that went from Springfield and it headed west, south and then west into Albany. The Congress declared that railroads are now the official post roads, and all post business, for all intent and purposes, the movements of mail were radiated out from certain depot areas, certain junctions. But these were no longer considered post roads, although to this day, people who live along them consider themselves on the post roads. Of course, they made long-distance stage travel obsolete for good and obvious reasons. You could go from Boston to New York in 12 hours, well, by the time that you got into the 1850s. Editor from the Providence Gazette goes back to the time when you had the stage wagons. And here's what he says in the Gazette. We were rattled from Providence to Boston in 4 hours and 50 minutes. If anyone wants to go faster, he may send to Kentucky and charter a streak of lightning. Well, I don't think it's so much going faster as holding on to that board while he was being gelled. In Sudbury here, the oldest operating hotel or inn on any of the post roads is still in existence. It's known as the Red Horse Tavern, previously been known as the Howe Tavern, and was immortalized by Longfellow when he wrote his book, Tales of the Wayside Inn. And it's still functioning today as an inn. Now, we got this wonderful mail system all set up. Nobody came up with an idea of putting a stamp on a letter. So this independent little company, private company in New York, came up with an idea. We'll make the stamps, and we'll sell the stamps, and they can use that to prove the postage that paid on that letter. That was in 1842. And they did it, and it took 5 years for the federal government for the light to go on. This is a good idea, and we can make some more money. So in 1847, we started printing stamps. We still didn't print money yet. It was another 10 years before we printed any money. We were still working with notes out of various banks. It got to be a problem. Because, and I will read this is from the Post Office Department, printed back in 1820. It says, the use of postage stamps for money sent through the mail became a real problem when several $1 million worth of stamps were in circulation as currency. If you didn't have any currency, you had a substitute because you got sick of paying the banks for notes. It said here, in 1882, it suggested legislation should be enacted to prevent the use of stamps in lieu of checks, notes, and money orders. Fortunately, it didn't pass. Now, I said I would tell you about mail and how grateful you were that you only had to pay 33 cents for a letter today. In 1830, 1840, the pay for the average individual, average laborer, was $1 a day. If you were a craftsman of sorts, an artisan, a blacksmith, or something like that, you might make $1.50 a day. In 1995, when I computed all of these, the average pay for people within this area, except people who work at Old Sturbridge Village, was $80 a day is the equivalent of an average day's pay in this part of New England. And if any besides those Old Sturbridge people get less than that, you got to complain. But a letter, to send a letter, one sheet of letter, and it was onion skin. You could read both sides of it by holding it to the light. It cost 25 cents then for 400 miles for that sheet. If you sent 3 sheets, it was 75 cents. Now, if you were really flush and had a lot of money, you might want to send a letter 1,000 miles to someone else you knew. That would be 62 cents for one sheet, or $1.86 for 1,000 miles. Now, all of this means something, because if you take that 62 cents and $1.82, 25 to 75 cents, in those terms, and put it in today's dollars and cents, look what it would cost you. One sheet, one onion skin sheet with no envelope and no stamp, it's folded onto itself only, would cost you $20 to send it 400 miles today. Or in 95 when I did the computation. It would be even worse today. 3 sheets, which cost 75 cents then, would cost you $60 today to send 400 miles. That's the tip of the iceberg. What if you're going to write to someone that's 1,000 miles away, and God forbid you send a letter to a missionary in Japan? One sheet going 1,000 miles for 62 cents, and it converts into $49.60. And if you were long-winded and you wrote 3 sheets, it was $1.86, which converts it to $148.80 today. Now remember, that was an onion skin with no envelope. You folded it in such a fashion that there was no envelope. You would seal it with a little speck of wax. And every square inch in that letter that you could, that wasn't exposed to the public, you wrote along the margins and what have you. Now I have one such letter to show you, and I can't pass it around. It's a very fragile artifact from 1849. This came from Canada. They're not up to speed yet. You don't see a stamp on there. It should have been a stamp on there, but it wasn't sent from our country, but it was sent to our country. So consequently, there are stamps along the way. When the mail is delivered to these certain points along the way where they collect the mails, they would stamp, so you have an idea of the travels of these letters. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see how thin the paper is? Yes. And in the course of writing this letter, they wrote in every square inch that they possibly could, along the back, it's not going to be exposed, along the edges, and then once they folded it, they fold very carefully, then nobody could see anything that was written inside. You could read through it, you can almost read it through the paper. And a little spot of wax was put upon it, and it was sealed. And there you are, there's your letter. Now that's a 3-page letter. If you're going to send this thing from here to North Carolina, in 1830, 1840, it would cost you $148.60 to mail it. Wow, what a deal, huh? Okay, now listen. This is the time I allotted for this. My time is up, but I take any questions you have. Be glad to. And if you don't have any questions, then I'm going to go sit down. Do you have any questions? How about our new selectman to be? I'll bet he wished he didn't say.
Totally unrelated to the post road, Bob. On your map, there's a little downstep in the southern border of Massachusetts into Connecticut. Back to your left.
Over by Springfield.
Oh, on the one.
Right straight up.
Southwick.
The jog.
Right there. That little jog where it jogs down.
Tell us how that originated.
What's the story behind that little jog there?
I don't understand what you said. This job here?
The little
The
state
state line.
line right here.
Oh, this?
Yeah.
State
Oh,
line.
that's the land that was in Ware. And they have a name for that. It was exchanged. That was exchanged for some land that really wasn't allocated to Ware. The manor land. They had a name for it.
Equivalent?
Pardon?
Was it equivalent?
The equivalent land, yes, you have it. And so consequently, we got that little section. Now it's like Brookfield. If you go to the southern part of Brookfield, the original Brookfield was a big square. Okay, and in that big square in 1673, they had a population of a few hundred people. And on which would be the east side of Coy Hill, there was a square grant of 500 acres that was given to a gentleman in Springfield. And the people raised so much hell about this. I mean, they were being denied a right to develop this. That in the bottom part of Massachusetts, we now have a 1 square mile square that reaches into Sturbridge. And it's still connected to the original town of Brookfield today. And it was totally uncalled for, but this was this territorial thing. You know, this was ours, how dare they give it to somebody else? And so I think our equivalent land is a similar type of deal. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Well, canes, do you have anything on the,
Post Road canes?
yeah,
Well, except that, you know, it was a newspaper gimmick at the time. That's why the canes were awarded and sponsored by a newspaper. And I don't know which newspaper now. I didn't. The Boston Post. Thank you. Thank you. You know, I had a stroke, and that's my alibi for forgetting everything. But the fact was, yeah, it was the Boston Post, and it was an advertising gimmick that caught on. People liked it. It showed a lot of respect for the senior-most citizens, and everybody hoped to live long enough to get it. And few did, but those that did hated to part with it. And when they left, they didn't take it with them. Their descendants hid it away, and a lot of them disappeared. Fortunately, you have yours, and we have ours. And it's guarded day and night, because I'm sure the powers to be would like to get their hands on it. They're not the oldest people in town, so you have to treasure this thing, because it's worth quite a bit of money, you know. There are collectors who will pay huge sums for this.
West Brookfield has plans.
Yes. Yes, sir.
How closely do any of the modern roads follow these original routes?
I did a thing for Yankee Magazine a few years back, and I did a thing for a fellow in Connecticut. He did extensive writing on post roads. And I just take the part from Leicester and go through Warren.
Remember that article?
And so few, there are still a lot of the old sections, but you have to know where to go to find them. And I know where the entire road is. If you ever have a summer picnic and anybody wants to go, I'll take you from the Leicester line to Western Warren and show you where the old road went, where every time it deviated from the present road, and you'll know where the old road was. And some of this is pretty humorous. This would make a nice bus trip if you ever decided in the summer that you wanted to do that sometime. I'd be happy to do that for you. And but at any rate, no, it didn't follow. It runs sort of along Route 9. But Route 9 has been straightened, and all kinds of things have happened to Route 9 along the way. And then Route 67 is another big part of it. And then when it gets into Warren, it goes off into Reed Street and up over the top of the hill. Still find the markers. Still find the markers.
Through the reservoir?
Say what?
Through the reservoir?
Yes, right through Cummins Pond. Right through Cummins Pond. When I was a boy, I used to be able to not quite walk all the way across the road. It was a gravelled road, because it didn't go out of service until Brigham built that pond, and Cummins moved in and took the name, and so his name is still attached to the pond, but the fact remains that you could still see where it went into the water and where it came out of the water. And then they went into this god-awful hill. I don't know how anybody would ever put a road in that spot, but that's what somebody decided ought to be there, and so that's where the road ran. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
All those markers of the red stone,
Yes.
they all are.
Well, it's a schist. It's a sedimentary type of stone. It's a sandstone type of thing with a lot of mica and iron oxide in it. That's where the red comes from. A lot of it was mined out of northern Connecticut and in East Long Meadow, Massachusetts. And it's interesting to know the town of Belchertown, I went up there, and some old geezer, he got up. He must have been 90 years old and weighed 75 pounds, and he was going to fight with me. You know, first he was on the Bay Path, and then he said, we got 2 stones up here that are Franklin markers. And I said, gee whiz, I'd like to see these. Well, he just didn't want anything to do with my lecture. He was totally wiped out with me. So I investigated what those stones were, and I found that North Brookfield itself plays a part in this. They didn't spend any money for stones, so they didn't have any stones here. But in 1820, they applied to the government, the federal government, and said, we'd like to have a post office in North Brookfield, far enough along. And it was a little territorial thing between North Brookfield and the other Brookfields anyway. They all had it, why not you? Yeah, still the same. But anyway, the federal government replied to the citizens of North Brookfield, say, yes, indeed, you may have a post office, you may staff it, but it'll be at no cost to the government. Whoa, you could have done it in the first place without asking, I suppose. However, the stones that were in Belchertown are not made of schist. This is not of Ben Franklin's design or ideas. These are made of granite. These are made of granite. Since then, I found in Suffield, Connecticut, they have a marker. They have 2 markers in Suffield that are made of granite. And there's a record in the town clerk's office where the citizens were asked at town meeting to vote for the cost of having the markers made and installed. So that would be a similar situation that North Brookfield had, except they elected to have markers. Now, North Brookfield may have put in markers. I don't know that. I don't know that. But the fact remains that I've seen nothing to say that they did. And yet I find in Sturbridge, they had 2 on the New Boston Road, and West Sutton on the Central Turnpike, they had another stone. So I found all kinds of stones are beginning to appear, and I wonder why not in North Brookfield? This was a thriving population at that time. Were they too stingy?
Where did you go from North Brookfield back to East Brookfield?
Well, yeah. But you look at Suffield, and it's just off the post road too.
Yeah.
It was probably a local thing, you know, include me in this sort of thing. Or it might have had branches leading out from it to small burgs and what have you. Yes, ma'am.
Brookfield had one down outside of Slab City. There's a stone up in the yard at Elm Hill. Then the next one down was in North Brookfield. They came down and went from Slab City down into East Brookfield. It didn't follow the Brookfield to East Brookfield.
No, we went up Slab City Road, you're right, but the stone was not in North Brookfield. That's the stone that I just recovered. And, surprise, it's 75 feet inside the Brookfield line. But at that time, what did it matter? What did it matter? Until 1812, you still were part of our, so for all intent and purposes, when I talk of Brookfield, it's the greater Brookfield. How can you differentiate? You know, there's no way.
Well, when it was in the road down there, it was actually Brookfield Sun.
See, Jeanette's going to fight with me, but it isn't. I surveyed it. I surveyed it, and it was in Brookfield. And as a matter of fact, I've gone up and marked it for the selectmen so that when they decide to put the stone back, it'll very much be located in Brookfield.
At that time, or approximate time, where did the route go from, say, North Brookfield to East Brookfield?
The road?
Yeah.
Well, the primary road actually is the road that you now travel on 148. That road was there.
To Brookfield.
To Brookfield.
Was there another one that went on to East Brookfield or not?
Yes, but I'm not certain to travel. I've mapped that, and I have it, but I haven't, I'm sorry, I haven't, I don't have it.
The old East Brookfield Road.
I don't have it in my computer, so I can't tell you. But I do know that there was a fork in the road, a branch in the road, that went from where Slab City Road actually went across the golf course.
Yeah.
And the Old Stone Bridge. And incidentally, beavers are up there, and they have now built a dam against the Old Stone Bridge. There's a bridge there that is 325 years old. It's being threatened, a slab bridge across the causeway there, and the beavers have cut down trees by the hundreds. You just can't believe what they've done. If you travel down Slab City Road, just before you get to the Wolcott marker on the left-hand side, it is a disaster. Big trees are down everywhere. And they've got a huge beaver house, maybe 15 feet across and 8 feet high. This is enormous. And they built their dam right up against this beautiful old bridge. And because we live in Massachusetts, you can't shoot them, you can't trap them. You just pray to God that he'll come get them, because there's nothing else you can do unless you can get a permit out of the, yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Is there a lot of literature on the road system and the transportation?
Actually, there is. Actually, there is. The Antiquarian Society is an excellent place to go in Worcester. if you can convince them to let them use their stacks and things, and you usually can. There's lots and lots and lots.
Identification.
There's lots of printed information. If you live in Massachusetts, you're fortunate because somebody wrote everything that happened down somewhere. And the Antiquarian Society collected it. They probably have 80% of everything that was printed in New England and the East Coast from the beginning of our country to 1840, I believe is the date. So if you look hard enough and long enough, you can find almost anything you want to there. Yes, sir.
Might mention there was a book published in the 1960s by Stuart Holbrook.
Yes.
The Old Post Road, part of the American Trails series.
Exactly.
And I just,
I may have-
copy of it fairly recently, I just have.
Yes, I may have quoted that.
When you,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yes, there's lots of information. You can go to your library and you can ask for books on the Post Road. If they don't have them, they can get them for you.
No,
Okay, so there's all kinds of information.
In the last 2 years, it's much easier to get into the Antiquarian Society.
Is it now?
Oh, yeah.
Since Peter McCorson, since Mr.
No,
McCorson left?
he's left.
Yeah, but he was great.
Yeah.
He was great. That was a battle between historians and people who were trying to protect the artifacts here. So nobody got to see anything because they were fighting among themselves. Curatorial staff. And any other questions, please? Wow, we had a lot of questions. Okay, well, then I thank you very much, and I hope you come up and look at these maps and familiarize yourself with them, and then next time you'll have a lot of questions to ask. And I thank you very much for your time.